I was told today that if I've done nothing else, I've done enough by bringing wine back to the colloquium. I almost feel like I should quit while I'm ahead. I first of all want to say hello. For those of you that I've not met, I apologize, but my name is Pearson, and I'm the new Provost. And I want to just comment about the turnout. This is wonderful, so thank you. Thank you for planning ahead. I know that that's what's required sometimes to make this time in your schedule to do this. But I did want to say that we're a lot of different kinds of communities. We're a scholarly and artistic community. We're a social community. We are sometimes a contentious community with each other. But it's important that we are a community, and at the heart of that goes to this kind of gathering to talk about what we do and why it's important to constantly be exploring through these kinds of presentations the nature of our work. And also just to catch up with each other. I mean, it was interesting to be new in the room, and I just felt like a lot of people were catching up. What was your summer like? What are you working on? That's what being a part of Purchase College is about. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for contributing to just the maintenance and happiness of our community. My understanding of the format traditionally has been to introduce both speakers. They will present, and then we will have time for questions afterwards. So I'm going to quickly, it's my pleasure to introduce John Lackey, who will talk first on index, observation, invention. He's assistant professor of art and design. Our second speaker will be Lorraine Plourde, assistant professor of media, society, and the arts. Her presentation is Cafés, effective labor, and the healing boom in Tokyo. So, John, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I was just talking to Beth before we started about how I don't seem to have any problem addressing a giant group of students every September, but I feel scared to death to be talking to you guys. So what I really want to try to do is talk about a few recent developments in my work that really represent both a continuation of themes that have developed over the years, as well as a kind of a radical shift in my ideology and practice as an artist. And I just wanted to say also that maybe when we're done after the question-answer period, I did bring prints of the actual work, so I hope you'll come and take a look. Hopefully they'll look better than they do on the projection. I want to just provide a little background on my work by talking about two pictures before I move into the recent work. The image on the left is an untitled photograph from 2005 from a series called Sound and Fury. And in this series, I've become sort of obsessed with the way that a factual rendering of the world with a camera could translate into an image that hovered on the border between abstraction and believability. What that photograph on the left literally describes is a large roadside sign seen in profile. The photograph sort of arrests that fleeting phenomenon that we all experience when we move around an object and it sort of flattens in space in front of us relative to our position in relationship to it. But the photograph does other things as well. It also erases any messages that might appear on the sign itself, rendering it momentarily mute. Even as we're made aware of its central position in the American commercial landscape. On the right is a picture I made about 5 years after that, titled Marquee. And once again, this is a photograph that's describing a sign, this time in a more frontal way, and we're looking at an exterior of a movie theater science display that happened to be empty at the time I photographed it. And by now, in 2010, when I made this picture, I had actually gone so far in my work to begin to print my photographs at the exact size of the thing that's in the world that I'm photographing. So there's sort of a one-to-one scale between my picture and the thing that I'm photographing. It's really an attempt in my in my mind, to sort of heighten the discrepancy between the sign in the world and its photographic double, which is also its own kind of sign in a way. This picture on the right is from a series called STET. And STET is a term that's borrowed from copy editing that means let it stand. It's a way for a copy editor to say, well, yes, this might be grammatically incorrect, but it should stay as is. This series of pictures was a way to try to bring the kind of empty promises of commercial signage directly into the gallery space, and at the time to kind of let them stand as sort of disembodied emblems of a crumbling economy. This is just an install shot of the photograph installed in the gallery, so the work is not framed, it's just sort of very simply mounted to a PVC material and displayed like very flat on the wall, so that again the photographs kind of begin to take on the presence of a kind of signage. They don't take on the presence of a traditional kind of photograph or even a painting really. That sort of flattening out and reinforcing the graphic quality of the pictures has been really important to me. After that exhibition, I became much more interested in the sort of subjective trace of human physicality in this sort of landscape of signs that I've been walking through. And I wanted to make work that translated a series of individual and often accidental gestures into new, somewhat autonomous forms. And so that was the challenge that I set out for myself, at least as I understand it in hindsight. And that leads me to talk about the work that I want to talk about today, which is the recent work. And this is an install shot of my exhibition at Kate Werbel Gallery last March, titled Low Relief. The 9 pictures in this exhibition were also printed at a 1-to-1 scale, but my method of arriving at the final prints was really different and very new for me. And so this is the left-hand wall of the show, and so what I'd like to do for the rest of my time here is just sort of walk you through one by one and talk about each individual picture. It should be apparent, hopefully, at the outset that none of the pictures in the show, in this small slide that you guys hopefully in the back can see okay, that they're not immediately recognizable. I think one of the things that happened in the previous work was there was you could locate the thing that you were looking at somewhere in the world. That was like one big change that's happened with the new work, where I'm sort of working hard to make a photograph that is both, again, a kind of indexical trace of something that exists in the world, but isn't easily recognized as resembling that thing. I guess the easier way to say that is it's not always clear what my pictures are of. The first picture in the show is titled Untitled, and I thought of it as a transition from the old work to the new work. So that kind of rigid geometry and kind of hyper flatness is starting to kind of go away in this picture. And what you're looking at is are the traces left on a shop window after an adhesive sign had been sort of ripped away. So this first picture is literally like me kind of like tearing down what had happened in the previous work and kind of building up something new. And I kind of think about the picture as a triple trace. There's the camera tracing of the subject, there's the trace left behind after the sign was removed, and then there's the photograph itself as a kind of trace of something that once existed in the world. Roland Barthes can say that a lot better than I can. This next piece is titled Spaces. It's one that really got me thinking about low relief as the title for the show. And here I'm actually looking at the back of a parking lot sign that was printed on plexiglass. As I worked on making the picture, I was really astonished by the amount of depth and kind of luminosity that I was able to kind of coax out of such a flat graphic surface. That's a detail that's a little hard to see, but I sort of still think of this as a photograph of what the inside of a sign looks like. This next picture is called Window Drawing, and it's one of 2 pictures in the show that represent the most radical shift in the way that I've been working over the past couple years. The work began, as many of my pictures often do, where I just was sort of walking down the street and noticed something out of the corner of my eye. And I noticed that a shop window of a closed down store had been painted over with this sort of gray paint. And when I got closer to the window, I realized that some probably like local kids had scratched into that paint to write their names in the glass. And as they did, and they scraped away the paint, they were actually revealing the sky that lied just on the other side of the window. And this might sound a little too dramatic, but I was so sort of taken aback by what I was looking at that I just sort of reached out and touched it. And that like moment of like touching the thing that I was about to make a photograph of, it sort of like later on in my mind like reminded me that I am not just a witness to the world, but I'm sort of a participant in it as well. And so I like immediately took out my car keys, and there's no police in the room, so I'll just say that I started then scratching into the window. And one of the things that was really wild is I realized that the window had actually been painted over twice. The first time was with black paint, and I imagined that maybe the community association didn't like that, so they asked for another lighter coat. So when I pressed lightly, I would reveal black paint, and when I pressed harder, I would reveal the sky, the light kind of coming through the back of that window. And the way that I began making the marks on the window was just by extending the marks that were already there. So if there was a letter R, for instance, or a B or something, I would sort of stick my keys into where the person left off and sort of continue that mark. I'm totally embarrassed because Julian from painting is here, and this is like maybe a horrible way to start painting, but that's how I started. And you know, and then I just after I had basically rendered the language illegible, I sort of just continued making, I guess, my own kind of language. I should just say that like that might not sound that crazy to some of you, but previously my practice was so much about a kind of contract that I had with myself that I was really just a witness. You know, I was really just watching things and not really taking an active role. And so it was kind of a big move for me. This is another piece called Plaque, which was in front of a bank building, but it hadn't been actually engraved yet, just this sort of brass plaque. And someone had come along and just ran their fingers along it. And this one was fun to print because as it was coming out of the printer, I would just stick my fingers on the print and get the size correct based on my own fingers. The picture on the left is called Untitled. The picture on the right is Office Door. These is just how they looked installed. I think it can kind of help to see the way they looked in the gallery to see the scale shift. This piece called Untitled represents like the second big shift in the work, which I guess has a lot more to do with invention, or a different kind of invention. I still think that the act of like moving through the world and responding to things is in itself a kind of inventive artistic act. But in this work, I actually made something completely in the studio for the first time. So I'm sort of setting up a large piece of plexiglass. There's window light kind of coming from behind the object, and also light coming over my shoulder from another window. And I'm basically on the surface of this piece of plexiglass building up a series of gestures that I've kind of witnessed over the last year or so of working out in the landscape. This one's called Office Door. A small town dentist office was being, I guess, rehabbed, and there was like paint from the inside of the building that had been like sprayed up against the glass. Some kids had come by and sprayed on the outside. There were pieces of tape that the painters had sort of hastily put on and then pulled back off, and so it's sort of like a series of like gestures, I think, that are both like accidental and intentional. The picture on the left is called Great. The middle one is Phone Booth, and the last one is Double. So I'll just move on to the last three pictures now. This one is called Grate, Grate. I think this might be the most recognizable picture from the show. It's just a photograph of an air conditioning grate in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And again, there's something, the thing that I like to try to say when I talk about this picture, and that I hope you'll see in the prints, is that even though I'm sort of working so hard to make a picture that is the same size and resembles very closely this thing that's in the world, the thing would not look like it does if it weren't photographed. So in some ways, what the pictures look like is really contingent upon some very, very basic photographic things like focus and depth of field, and in particular light. Light is this big presence in all of the pictures, whether or not it's immediately recognizable. And so it's important to me that the work kind of hinges on that translation of the world into a kind of photographic space. Phone booth was a really fun one to make because it was a great way to just study, again, kind of accidental gestures. This is just the piece of plexiglass on the inside of a phone booth, and these marks that have just been made over years of people like scraping up against the side as they're sort of on the phone. And then behind that was a piece of like backlit signage that was being illuminated just from light on the street. And the last picture of the show was titled Double. It's a little hard to see in the slide here, but sort of a very bright afternoon, I was sort of walking by a bodega in Brooklyn, and there was another one of those pieces of like, sort of leftover adhesive that had slowly built up dust and detritus over time. And I noticed that because of the direction of the sunlight, the way that it was hitting the surface, and also because of the time of day and sort of the color temperature, that there was this really amazing kind of color shift where the thing on the surface of the window was projected in its exact double just a few inches away, but in a completely different color because of the way the shadow kind of took on the color of the blue sky and that was around me. And I feel like this picture sort of brings back the idea that I tried to talk about in the very first picture of the photograph trace as a kind of double. And in this case, it is a double that's contingent on that sort of dueling presence of indexicality, observation, and invention. And that's it. Yeah.
So thank you all for attending, and thank you to Suzanne and Barry for the invitation to speak. So this is a new side project based on ethnographic fieldwork that I began conducting in Tokyo in 2010. And the research that I'll be presenting today will be coming out in the journal Japanese Studies next year. But actually my primary research deals with sort of avant-garde music culture in Tokyo and listening practices. So this is quite a departure from my main research. So Japan is often spoken of as a cat-loving nation. Well, in fact, it's almost a cliche to speak about the ubiquitous image of the cat in Japanese everyday life. Of course, here we can think of Hello Kitty to Manekineko, the good luck cat, or even more sort of recent internet-based cat memes. So there's almost something of a cat zeitgeist that I'm thinking of at the moment. However, I'm less interested in representations of cats and rather looking at actual living cats in post-economic bubble Japan. So the cat cafe boom peaked in 2009, yet is still a significant retail phenomenon throughout Japan, but particularly in Tokyo and urban areas. So some of the questions that I'm sort of interested in with this project are how do humans encounter animals in Japan, not as companions or private owners, but rather as consumers, seeking some kind of direct sensory contact with animals at a time of fairly profound social and economic anxieties in Japan. So here referring to the sort of lingering recessionary conditions as well as sort of the post-3/11 or post-Fukushima moment. So first to kind of think about what they actually are, cat cafes. So they're public spaces where customers pay by the hour to spend time, sort of relax, spend time with, read manga, and hang out with cats. So they're highly domestic spaces that evoke the kind of feeling and ambiance of being in one's own apartment. And this is through a carefully staged use of furniture, lighting, reading materials, as well as background music. And I'll speak a bit later about the type of domesticity that's created and evoked in these spaces. That's, I think, very important. So I'm sort of interested in why would someone visit a cat cafe? What desire motivates someone to go to a cat cafe? And what does it mean to look at animals in this context as both a product, as both a commodity, as well as a form of labor? And what sensations, what emotions do the cafes market to customers? And finally, why cats and not, say, dogs or other animals? So there's something about the cat as a kind of, I'm thinking of kind of an unruly non-human actor that's integral to sort of the production of this kind of, a kind of peculiar or alternative type of domesticity in these cafes. So cats are both marketed as healing objects, as well as laboring objects, as well as kind of sensory or sensual objects. So all cafes draw upon this discourse of healing, or iyashi in Japanese, as well as furei, which is a more recent Japanese word that refers to touch, so some kind of tactility that speaks to kind of mutual contact between two parties. And a lot of times that can be between human and non-human animals. So furei, that kind of touch, is something that we see a lot in the discourses through which these cafes market themselves. So people go to these cafes to be healed. And this is something that everyone told me about. Cafe employees, owners, patrons, everyone talked about this desire to be healed. Salarymen come here after work, as one customer confided in me. They come here after work to as a way to kind of cope with their grueling jobs. And so by going to these cafes, they're able to kind of persevere, or gambaru in Japanese, the next day at work, as I was told. So the healing boom, the healing industry, really exploded in the mid-1990s in Japan. And so it occurred, or the boom itself occurred at a moment of really profound national traumas, which was the Kobe earthquake in January of 1995, and then 2 months later, the sarin gas subway attack in Tokyo. So these two events were very, of course, profoundly traumatic events for the nation. And so you saw sort of the strengthening of the healing boom. And of course, these sorts of discourses are now increasing in this sort of post-3/11 moment. So after the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown. And we're seeing sort of an increase in discourses on loneliness, social disconnectedness, as well as social and economic precarity, especially for Japanese youth. And so goods that might sort of be included under the healing boom would be music, therapeutic music, aromatherapy, robot interaction, color therapy, and now more recently pet therapy or cat cafes. So to think about the ways in which this sense of iyashi or healing is sort of marketed by the cafes, I was very interested in things like flyers, websites. So how the cafes themselves use this kind of discourse or market this to their patrons. So this flyer, of course, is very densely packed with information, but what's important is, of course, the name Cat Magic, but above that, we see them marking themselves as both a cat cafe, and here we see this notion of iyashi, or healing. So it's also marking itself as a space of healing, as well as the intriguing, won't you fall into the cat spill, which is always important. Another flyer, which kind of a different type of layout, but again, kind of describing what type of space it is, that it's this kind of relaxed space where you can drink tea while playing with cats in a leisurely fashion. You can take photos of them, but again, using the exact same phrase, iyashi no kukan, so healing space, essentially. So again, they're drawing on similar kinds of discourses of healing. A student once remarked that these images almost look like newborn photos, these pictures of cats, which I thought was kind of something I had fun with. Okay, so the cafes themselves all market these spaces as one of healing, but then we also see, interestingly, in guest books. So cafes feature patron guest books, so they can sort of write about, notate the date they attended and sort of their reactions to the space. But again, we see this evoked in the the patrons' responses. So many of them echo this idea of iashi, or healing. So they talk about, the sensorial qualities of the cat. So some talk about the warmth or the fluffiness, the cuteness. There's something about that allows patrons to feel that they're healed, as well as cute drawings. And sometimes patrons will draw specific cats in that cafe. They'll be fans of one particular cat, which is something that I noticed. So they also create this kind of iashi, or healing, through the design of the cafe itself. So the sort of typical format is one in which you have sort of pastel colors, pastel-colored furniture, walls, sort of soft, fluffy rugs, soft lighting, often barely discernible, kind of gentle background music, and often favoring kind of, soft textures or round shapes. Again, another sort of example of that sort of more typical design format. But then another space where I did actually conduct much of my fieldwork at took a very different approach. So they, of course, drew on darker furniture, darker lighting, and an employee told me that they really created it in opposition to what she called children's rooms, referred to the other style that almost has a kind of infantile quality. And so this particular space, they offer blankets, sort of soft, fluffy blankets for patrons to cover themselves with. And they want patrons to feel as if they're at home reading manga in a space that happens to have cats nearby. So there's, really this idea of trying to create this kind of familiar and domestic feeling for the patrons. The owner of this cafe told me that he tried out different couches to find kind of the most sleep-inducing type of couch for this space. And it's not unusual. I would see patrons there completely stretched out with the blanket completely up to their neck, just look like as if they were at home taking a nap. So this idea that cat cafes, there are these public but highly intimate and relaxed spaces. They're encouraged to relax and simply do nothing, but they're also sharing this very intimate behavior, with other patrons. Even if they don't talk to the other patrons, they're still sharing something very intimate, sleeping in front of other patrons and cats. When I was in Japan last summer, I noticed middle-aged male patron came in, made a beeline for a couch, just flopped down, fell asleep immediately, and just started snoring really loudly while the cat slept by undisturbed, totally unfazed. And patrons, who I deduced to be new patrons, seemed, were kind of trying to stifle their laughter, but in fact, this reaction was actually perfectly acceptable. The owners of these cafes, it's precisely engineered and predicted. They want customers to have this type of response. They want them to feel this kind of home or domesticity. So this iashi, or healing, is created through the space itself, but also, of course, through the supposed healing powers of the cats. But then through this tactile contact with cats. But then what I found interesting was, patrons weren't always able to actually have contact with cats. So what I found was, for a lot of new patrons, really the camera lens kind of mediated their engagement. And so they would often not even touch the cats, but just take photos. And for cats to directly approach new patrons was pretty uncommon. We would see, not uncommon to see cats, going in a space that's far out of reach of patrons. So then I was sort of interested in what is their actual engagement. If these discourses of healing are predicated upon having this direct contact, then what happens when the cats don't want to be touched? So I found that cafes have to compensate for this kind of indifference, for the cat's indifference toward the patron. So you see these sort of, it becomes almost kind of a public spectacle. So feeding times are often advertised. Patrons can, at some places they can actually, interact. They can actually feed the cats. Here they're just taking photos. But again, one of the rare times where you'll see cats approach new patrons is by, they can buy snacks. So many cafes will sell snacks. So this is, sort of one of the few times you'll see cats directly approaching a patron when they've got snacks in their hand. So something that was very interesting to me was that a lot of these patrons are cat owners themselves, which I thought was very curious, why you would go to one of these spaces if you already had cats. And so a lot of the cafes kind of market this kind of intimacy as one of kind of romantic, kind of anthropocentric relationship. And so one cafe owner I talked with talked about it as a secret love affair for cat owners that go to these cat cafes. So you say uaki, the Japanese word for uaki, which is kind of a flirtatious but kind of a illicit love affair. So that when they go home, as he put it, their own cat will surely know that they've been quote unquote cheated upon by the cafe cats. So to think about sort of the ways in which they're, the cats themselves are sort of managed, or sort of the way in which they become these kind of fantastic and kind of sensual sites of investment for the patrons, I find that these cafes are structurally similar to host clubs in Japan. And so one way to think about this is the way they're sort of marketed in guidebooks. So all cafes have these guidebooks, sort of glossy photos, as you can see here. Some staged photos, some non-staged. You see sort of the basic biographical information about the cats, their breed, birth date, name. But another example. These numbers here actually indicate when the cat entered that cafe, so the order in which they got the cats. But so it was very interesting to me to see the way in which their personalities and their physical bodies became these very sort of fantastic and kind of sensual sites of investment, to the extent that, you know, I would almost see language like sexy and pretty and dazzling to refer to the cats. And then this is another example where instead of a guidebook, they're placed on the wall, each individual cat, kind of listing their personal quirks. But then I was very sort of interested in the English language guidebook at one cafe, where they compared the cat to Marilyn Monroe. So all of these sort of ways in which the cats are sort of are managed and marketed are ways to kind of individualize the cats as these sort of distinct, complex individuals, distinct entities. One patron told me, who only went to one cafe, told me, I go to this one because the cats are the most distinct. Each one has its own personality. And so such that this occurs to the extent that they become imbued with human interests or attributes. So here, you know, we have the cat with the Twitter account. So to think about this idea of cat labor, as I'm referring to it, I was often struck by the ways in which cats were referred to as workers or laborers by the cafes. And so a lot of them use this sort of hybrid kind of Japanese anglicized phrase, neko staff, so neko's cat. So cat staff, which was a common phrase that many of these cafes use. And I found that, you know, their labor, their affective labor, is actually instrumental to producing this feeling of home, this feeling of domesticity. But here in this context, labor in this context is tricky because it's different from other forms of animal labor. When we think of things like working dogs or herding dogs or seeing eye dogs. This is a different type of labor that's, I think, happening here. So drawing on the work of philosophers Hart and Negri, who talk about immaterial labor. So for them, affective labor is one type of immaterial labor. And that what it is sort of producing sensations or feelings in the patrons. And we can almost compare it to emotional labor, as we see in the service industry, as in flight attendants, fast food workers. And so to think about this labor as immaterial is such that the products are intangible. So it's producing feelings, it's producing sensations. But that's intertwined with the material labor that the staff, the human staff, are producing. So the human staff are maintaining the daily business environment, cleaning up after the cats. But that's sort of intertwined with the immaterial labor that's happening with the cats. Right, so here's another example of this use of cat staff. Some cafes put cats on vacation. So they'll take them out for a few days. Then they'll use the word for vacation. They'll put them in an employee's apartment for the weekend. Another cafe worker told me that when the cafe closes, the cats are effectively on break. Another cafe owner told me that when the cafe closes, instead of keeping them in cages overnight, as many other cafes do, they take them to one of the workers' homes to sleep overnight. And he actually said, if we didn't do that, they would not be happy the next day during business hours. So there's a kind of clear and sort of interesting recognition of kind of the effects of this labor on the cats in a way. And then the ways in which their labor is monitored and kind of managed in other ways, is such that if cats are unproductive, so if they're just sort of sleeping or sitting quietly, they're made to be productive. So we see here an example that some cafes do, as you can imagine what's happening. So these two young men were sitting there, none of the cats were paying attention to them. So the cafe owner is very cognizant of what's happening, and if they notice that none of the cats are coming to you, they'll facilitate that interaction, they'll facilitate that contact. So just to conclude with just a few thoughts, the way in which I'm thinking about these cat cafes is that through these kinds of multi-species encounters, they're kind of revealing perhaps transformations in social connectivity in Japan. So people talk a lot about loneliness, social precarity, that people are feeling disconnected from a sense of social community in Japan. But there's something very intriguing happening here, and that it's a kind of peculiar type of domesticity, and that's also flexible. A patron can enter, and then they can leave. So they're sharing this kind of intimate, relaxed behavior among, with other patrons and cats. But the cat is somehow, as this kind of unruly, non-human actor, it's kind of, and as I would argue, a fetishized symbol of domesticity, is actually an ideal kind of actor for creating this kind of perhaps new type of domesticity in Japan. So I will leave it there.
Wow, I now understand so much more about my life with our cat, Baba. We said we'd take some questions, so where would you like to start? Yeah.
For Lorraine, how much do people pay to do this? Is it like on a healthcare scale or like a cafe scale?
It's an hourly rate, so it's usually about 1,000 to 1,200 yen, so something like $12 to $15 an hour. Yeah, so they're not cheap, and a lot of times they'll offer 3-hour packs, so it might come with a drink, coffee. But it's not cheap.
Interesting. Yeah.
I went to a talk years ago about ukiyo-e, the woodblock prints, and the person was saying how in Japanese culture the fleeting experience is really valued, so looking at soap bubbles or rainbows. And I think this talk was talking about parent-child shared interactions. So like there were lots of woodblock prints where the parent and child would be doing a rainbow or soap bubbles together. Do you think, I was thinking about cats versus dogs. And I remember I was in Japan and I saw all these dogs that were dyed all these colors and were trotted around like mascots, almost like bright blue, bright pink. Do you think the fact that the cat is unavailable or only somewhat available is part of what makes it a healing experience within Japanese culture?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think about that question too, because a lot of times people think about cats in the context of Japan as kind of auspicious animals, but no one in my fieldwork talked about them in terms of being lucky or auspicious, but rather it was kind of their unruliness, their kind of lack of, kind of less faithful than dogs. That was kind of part of their appeal. And I think I'm trying to think about that in relation to this kind of new type of, a kind of alternative, peculiar type of domesticity at this moment where, it's very different from the kind of post-war, kind of more hegemonic, normative model of domesticity, sort of productive family unit. That there is something interesting happening. Why cats? And I think, there's something about that. I don't know, harder to get contact with.
So this was fascinating. Thank you for this presentation. And so Mike, I was wondering if it was maybe fundamentally about relaxation, because I don't know where else you could go in public and like acceptably take a nap, but like $12 an hour probably isn't too bad of a deal for that. So I wonder, the cat's kind of also a fundamentally relaxing animal, but it creates this space where I would imagine that it's unacceptable for people to work. Like if we took out a laptop, that might be a little strange. It must be like one with few sort of quiet places in a way in Tokyo.
Yeah, I think I noticed there was a significant difference in the way, I didn't get into it here, but the way regular patrons sort of interacting in the cafe versus new patrons. So regular patrons, and I talked with employees about this, that cats will start to recognize them, whereas with new patrons, they'll run from them, they'll flee. They don't want to be touched. And so I noticed that a lot of the regular patrons were oftentimes not even petting the cats, just kind of sitting quietly. And I remember one cafe worker told me that she thinks that the cats like the sort of men in their 30s the regular patrons, because they are the most calming, as she used the word, because they don't run after the cats. So when you see new patrons, you can immediately tell a new patron because they just walk around the room trying to entice the cats, and the cats just don't want anything to do with them.
John, I'm kind of, this may be a naive, Philistine kind of question, but I couldn't help noticing just like the degree to which I was just intrigued by figuring it out.
Yeah.
Like looking at the imagery, and,
Yeah.
especially after you explained the first one.
Right.
It was a sign on its side, which
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah.
And then every single one, I'm like, oh, what was this? And then I'm like, oh, yeah. So I just wondered about it because there's this like super realistic thing about it, and then somehow the removal of it seemed like a necessary contextual cue made me not get it.
Right.
And then with your explanation, but you're not always there.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering about that. When you don't have the artist there to make the explanation, what
I think like what I was trying to do in the talk, and I think it's because we're looking at the work in such a short span of time, is I am doing a little bit of the work for you that hopefully you would figure that out. I mean, if you spend the time and the thing about, I was just talking to my students about this afternoon. It's like I'm really spending a lot of time to make an argument for the pictures to exist in actual physical space. So they're not really meant to be reproduced in books. They're not really meant to be viewed online. It's really about you being in physical proximity with that thing. And hopefully, if I'm doing my job well enough, you spend time enough to figure that out. But I mean, even if you don't, like even if, the first picture I talked about, like being the trace of like something that was ripped away. I mean, even if you don't understand that completely, that's totally fine. And that's one of the reasons why, as you move through that work, like some pictures are really intentionally not titled, and some are, when they are titled, they're titled exactly what they are. And when they're not titled, they're just not titled. And so I think there's a kind of give and take within the titling of the work too that hopefully will facilitate that. Yeah.
Back there.
Yeah, this is actually a follow-up to Rudy's. I was wondering almost the opposite, which is whether you don't want, in fact, that sort of context of use to disappear. And I wonder whether if you tell us a little more about what makes something a trace, it wouldn't help us think about whether we should try to figure out what it is really, or let that go and look at other aspects of what's in front of us.
Well, I think that, and I didn't show that much of the previous work, but I feel like what was going on in this new group of pictures was so much a reaction to what happened in the previous body of work, which was made up of pictures that were really immediately recognizable. And I think one of the things I wanted to try to do was to sort of slow down the read in the way that you're sort of talking about. I mean, the trace is, as I'm talking about it within this body of work, the trace has to do with the photograph being a kind of double of a thing that exists in the world. There's the really early idea of like photogenic drawing, this idea of the photograph, the camera as a drawing tool, or the camera as a tracing instrument. So I mean, I feel like there's a lot of nods to that in the way that I'm presenting the work, the way what's being presented. But I am taking steps to like slow that way down, so that so that in some ways you recognize, hopefully, that what you're responding to did once exist, and maybe existed very close to the form that the picture now takes. But at the same time, this new object is somehow unknowable, and that's important.
That's right next to you.
So I remember once talking to somebody who, now an artist, but she used to be responsible to make a photographer making reproductions in MoMA, and the problems of color fidelity, let's say reproductions of paintings and the like. And this trace you're talking about, and you reference like the pencil of nature, Talbot, or nature reproduces itself. You have it here in in sunlight, I think.
Yeah, it
I
is
guess
sunlight,
the
yeah.
crux of the question, you have these sort of very urban, gritty, colorful substances. You are using this sort of sunlight, you know, whatever Kelvin temperature of the day it was. I'm curious, you choose a morning hour, the golden hour, mid-afternoon. How do you get your also shadows, and is that a part of the work? And maybe they're nighttime images that I don't know about.
Yeah.
And the follow-up would be the fidelity and how relevant that is to the work of the, you say you like the size, and there's a certain sort of optical trompe-l'oeil fidelity perhaps, or at least objective fidelity in size and scale. But I'm curious if color is important in this fidelity, different choice of film emulsion. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the fidelity thing is definitely, it's not something that I necessarily like. It's something that I feel committed to at the moment. It's like sort of that's the way the work seems like it needs to be. You know, that one-to-one thing that I talked about. That all seems really key to what I'm after. The light question is a really good one.
Day.
Yeah.
Like almost time.
Yeah, and that's like, I mean, it really varies, but I mean, I think I'm kind of I'm definitely the kind of person that is, especially for this work, and even the last body of work, looking for this subject to be just blasted in some way with, you know, so it's all the hours that you're not supposed to photograph typically. It's like between 11 and 2 when you're not really, you know, it's when something is just completely, you know, overrun with this really intense raking light that kind of, it's the light that I love from Evans that just seems to get into everything, you know, so nothing can really hide in the pictures. Having said that though, I feel like some of the pictures, you know, the picture that I made in the studio, it's really interesting that that's a really different kind of light. It's a really diffused, it's diffused both in the direction that is coming from like in front of the camera and then coming towards me, but then there's also light that's bouncing over my shoulder from another surface. So I feel like that wasn't totally conscious in the making of it. It was just something I started to respond to while I was putting it together. But I do think it's interesting that the one that I made in the studio has the most kind of complicated and confusing light.
Is that drifting medium, like Ravel out of register, like Ludwig and sort of?
Yeah. I mean, I think like the riffing part, like for me, and like I could relate this back to your question about like your sort of gearhead question, is like, and that's sort of tied to the fidelity issue too. It has to do with the way that digital technology can describe the world. So this is also the first body of work that I've worked with completely digitally, beginning to end. So there's no analog, there's no film, there's no view camera like there used to be in the old work. And I do think that there's something about the digital camera description that is both sort of hyper accurate and also completely off in some way. And that to me also feels like very like relevant to the way we just kind of experience reality in general. And that's something that I'm sort of trying to play around with and making it work.
Yeah.
I have a comment for you and a question for you, which is in terms of traces, I also thought about writing and how writing needs traces and how the gray one that you inscribed marks. I first thought, oh, very Cy Twombly, and it's not exactly, but it evokes writing to me and that kind of trace. And my question for Lorraine was about, I've heard that people thought that cats were abused because they weren't allowed to sleep, which is what cats like to do. And you were talking about how they were awakened when they weren't animated enough for the patrons. So I was curious if you had heard that, or if that was
heard that, but
you don't think so. They look pretty well characterized.
yeah, I mean, it's tricky. The animal rights movement in Japan is very opposed to this.
Right, that's what I heard.
Yeah,
They were
yeah.
opposed to that
So,
technique.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, in there, they all have guidebook, kind of etiquette guidebooks, that if you're a new customer, when you enter, they ask you if this is your first time, they give you a sort of guidebook to read, and it gives you all the sort of rules and regulations, you know, hand washing, sanitizer. but you have to have your flash turned off on your camera. But as well as they say don't wake up the cats if they're sleeping, don't disturb or wake them up. And yet I saw people would always pet or wake up cats that were sleeping. I never saw any staff try to kind of dissuade this. So it's really the camera flash was the biggest no-no. But they were certainly didn't have a problem with people waking up.
I had also a question for Lorraine. I wanted to know if there's anything distinctive about the human-to-human interactions that occurred in this kind of scenario.
Yes, and in fact, I couldn't fit that in, but that is actually something that was very kind of prominent in a lot of these cafes, which is that there's something really important about the patron-to-patron contact, and that the cat. One interview I did with a cafe worker, he sketched out on a piece of scrap paper this kind of crude diagram. It had person, a character for person, and a cat, and then person. So the cat was some kind of intermediary in this instance. And he told me at their cafe, because cats sleep for so many hours a day, they don't want patrons to feel bored. So their sort of protocols, they really make an attempt to really interact with patrons and speak to them. And he said, even went so far as to say, if we had a sign on the door saying the cats are out today, they would still come. The patrons would still come up. And they'll hold events. They hold birthday parties for the cats. I went to one. And it was very much a kind of social, and you could tell that they were nearly all regular patrons that were kind of all meeting and greeting in this event, very kind of banal yet also kind of surreal spectacle. And they sang, happy birthday. The cat was wearing a pink kimono. Very intriguing.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. So we'll go here and then to Suzanne.
A question for Lorraine. It seems like the face that you showed us seems to imagine different kinds of domesticity, and I was wondering if there are any cafes that attempt to create a more like feline space that would be coming to, so rather than the opposite, that rather than facing domesticity, you're coming into their own home and also in that way obscuring the issue of labor and so forth.
Yeah, there were some that, you mean as in a domesticity that's more geared towards the cats?
Yeah, because usually we see cats living in our homes, right? And then sort of imagine what their own home would be like, and then they would be coming into their home, somehow visit or something like that.
Yeah, there were some I think that might kind of evoke what you're getting at. I did most of my field work at spaces like these, but yeah, and the ones that I think you're speaking of, to me, felt very uncomfortable. And so these were kind of there was just more happening, just really logically. People sleeping and so on.
We have time for one more, I think, Suzanne.
I have to say, when you first said your title of your talk, and I was imagining what it was about, the last thing I imagined was that it was about a cat cafe. I just think it's metaphorical for something. But I'm wondering, given what you know about American culture and what you know about Japanese culture, other than the health code issue here, can you imagine what it would take for us as a culture to find this an attractive recreational activity?
Every time I give this talk to my students, they always say, why don't we have that? I think it would be attractive and popular to a certain segment of the U.S., but I just think the U.S. is too litigious for something beyond even just health codes. I just think it's too litigious to allow this kind of type of space.
But I couldn't help.
If someone got scratched, they'd sue for.
But I couldn't. Are folks here familiar with Best Friends Animal Shelter in Utah? It's a 700-acre sanctuary devoted to the rescue and rehabilitation of animals that have been abandoned. We had some relatives who quit their jobs, moved to Utah to be a part of the sanctuary, and there's a cat colony there. It's a huge building devoted to cats. It's the most popular place for people to volunteer. Everybody wants to work in the cat colony. And I couldn't help but think about your study in relationship to Best Friends Animal Shelter. They have a waiting list of hundreds of people who want to work in the cat colony. It's amazing. They have 700 cats that they take care of. And so it's a huge undertaking. But you answered that question for me. That's why. And there's something to it.
And I think what to me is problematic about this phenomenon is, and what was tricky to me doing fieldwork was that, you know, they're really just commodities. And the question of, you know, what happens when they get too old, what the iashi or healing appeal of an elderly cat, well, that's, I can't say because the phenomenon is too new, but it is worrisome. I went to one kitten cafe and the kittens were displayed ground level with, you know, floor-length windows, so anyone walking by could look in and be enticed by these frolicking kittens. And in fact, once they were no longer kittens, they were placed on the second floor in a windowless room. You could play with them, but they were just pretty much shielded off. So there's something very troubling about this because it's in a retail sort of economy.
So John, why don't you end for us tonight by talking about, you mentioned this was a new kind of evolution in your work. Where do you go now? I mean, I thought it was fascinating to think about looking from a sign from the inside out. So
yeah. Well, you make more, and that it sounds like an obvious choice, but that one piece that I talked about that I made completely in the studio, that I've made like, you know, about 15 different kind of iterations of that same piece, so over and over again, so that initial kind of surface is staying the same, but what gets straight behind it, what kind of light strikes it, is changing every time. So I'm sort of working on a kind of a suite, I guess, of those. And then still making more pictures out in the world. And one of the things I've been noticing is that when I start to intervene in the world, things start to look a little bit too perfect in a way. Yeah. And I've actually been trying to like coax that out more clearly so that maybe there can be more of a sense in the pictures of like things that I'm taking a more active role in and things that are more kind of observed. Yeah.
Well, a round of applause for our presenters. Thank you. This is really great. It's fascinating. And a couple of shameless plugs. If you have more time, since you're here anyway, I'd go down to the Art and Design building. They have a wonderful week of print week going on, and tonight is there's just all kinds of activities. I know, John, you're on your way there next. Yep. It started at 4:30, but it's ongoing till 7, I believe. Yep. So please go down and partake of that. And you know, my ask of you is, you know, talk this up. You know, if you can't come next time, that's great, but recruit somebody. Recruit future, contact Suzanne if you're interested in the future participating more formally, right? I mean, this is something that we're going to continue to do, and I just want to say this is great. These are the things that make being here very special. So thanks for coming tonight. There's more food and there's wine, so please hang out, talk. There's no reason to rush off.